Hello and welcome back to the Deep Dive. We usually start these conversations with a bit of a roadmap. Here's the data, here's the study. But today, I actually need to ask you for a favor before we even get into it.
Oh, okay. That's a bit of a departure from our usual facts-first approach, isn't it?
It is. I want to try a little visualization experiment.
Yeah.
So wherever you are right now, unless you're, driving or something, please keep your eyes open. But if you can, I'd like you to just close your eyes for a moment, take a breath, and just kind of travel back in time with me. Go back to when you were, say, 15 or 16, you're sitting at a desk, the wood's probably all scratched up, the chair is that hard plastic kind.
And we're not asking you to remember the geometry proof on the board, I'm guessing.
No. Forget the lesson. I want you to tap into the actual feeling in that room, that little knot in your stomach because the teacher's walking down the aisle with the tests, or the way the whole room just goes silent when a hard question is asked. That weight, both, the literal backpack and the metaphorical one. Can you feel that? That specific mix of, boredom, anxiety, and just pressure.
That internal landscape. That is exactly where today's source material lives. We aren't looking at a government white paper or a big statistical analysis today. We're looking at a text called Visionary Reforms for Modern Education, and specifically a section titled, What I Would Change in My School-College System.
And honestly, just calling it a text feels a little cold. Reading this, it felt like finding a letter someone wrote at 2 in the morning and just left on a desk. It's incredibly raw. It's like a personal confession.
It really is. It frames the whole thing not as a system to be optimized, but as a human experience, that's currently broken. The author isn't asking for new tablets or better air conditioning. They're pleading for a system that just acknowledges that students are actual human beings.
Which brings us right to the first massive pillar of this confession. The author starts with a statement that is just so blunt, it almost hurts to read. They just say, stop treating students like machines.
It's such a powerful opening, and it's an analogy that we've all sort of accepted, right? The school is a factory. But the author really breaks down what that feels like from the inside.
Right, because a machine just has a function. You have your input, your process, your output.
Yeah.
And the text describes the student's function as this relentless loop. Write fast, memorize more, score higher.
It's all about the performance metric. And if you think about a machine, you don't ask it how it's feeling. You check its efficiency. And the author points out this devastating silence in their education. They list the questions that were just never asked.
This part really, really stuck with me because I tried to remember if a teacher ever actually asked me these things. The questions were, are you okay? Are you confused? And the really big one, are you scared of failing?
That last one. Are you scared of failing? That's so crucial. In a machine-based system, failure is just a malfunction. It's an error code. But for a human being, failure is terror. It's shame. And by not asking that question, the system completely ignores the emotional reality of being a student.
But, playing devil's advocate for a second here, schools have to have standards, right? You do have to learn the material. Is it really the school's job to manage the emotional state of every single student?
And that's the classic counter-argument. But here's how the source addresses that. It says, we were taught how to solve problems on paper, but not how to handle pressure in real life. So if the school's goal is to prepare you for the future, and the future involves massive amounts of pressure, then ignoring the emotional side of things isn't just mean, it's actually negligent. It's failing to prepare the student for the world they're about to enter.
That's a really, really good point. We treat pressure as just a byproduct of the work, instead of something we actually need to teach kids how to navigate.
Exactly. The source mentions feeling like a roll number, not a human. When you reduce a person to a number in a grade book, you are effectively saying their output is more important than their internal state. And that creates a very specific kind of damage.
Which leads us directly into the second pillar the author brings up. And this is really the engine that drives that whole machine feeling.
Yeah.
The obsession with marks.
Marks became our identity. That's a direct quote. And I think we really need to sit with that for a moment. It's not marks were important, it's marks became who we were.
It creates this sort of caste system, doesn't it? The text is very clear about the binary. High marks meant respect. Low marks meant silence and shame.
The word shame shows up a few times in this text, and it's so heavy. Shame is different from guilt. Guilt is, I did something bad. Shame is, I am bad. So when a system ties your worth as a human being to a percentage on a test, a low score convinces a child that they are fundamentally broken.
And the tragedy is, the source argues that this whole metric is just completely wrong. It says unequivocally, intelligence is not a number.
Yeah, and this is where the author really tries to dismantle our traditional view of the smart kid. We all know that stereotype. The kid who raises their hand first, speaks the loudest, always gets the A. But the source asks us to look a little closer. It says a student who speaks less might actually be thinking deeply.
I love that distinction. The idea that silence isn't emptiness. It could just be processing.
And on the flip side, the student who fails exams might still succeed in life. The source is just begging teachers, and really all of us, to look at potential, not percentages.
But how do you measure potential if you don't use percentages? I mean, that's the hard part, isn't it? It's easy to grade a math test. It's hard to grade curiosity or resilience.
It is hard, but the source isn't really asking for a new grading rubric. It's asking for a shift in values. If a teacher sees a kid who's struggling, do they see a bad student who needs to be corrected? Or do they see potential that just hasn't been unlocked yet? That shift in perspective, it changes everything. It changes the entire tone of the classroom.
And speaking of the tone of the classroom, that brings us right to the third emotional pillar in this text. And this is the one that I think explains why so many of us felt that knot in our stomachs back in the day. The culture of fear.
Fear is the enemy of learning. I mean, biologically, neurologically, we know this. When you're afraid, your brain goes into survival mode. You can't be creative, you can't make new connections, and yet the source lists fear as a primary component of the school day.
Yeah, they break it down into this specific triad. Fear of asking questions, fear of making mistakes, and fear of being judged.
Just think about that first one. Fear of asking questions. The entire point of school is to learn what you don't know. If you're afraid to admit you don't know something, the entire process just breaks down right there.
The source has this just heartbreaking observation about the quiet students. He says they aren't quiet because they don't know the answer. They're quiet because they are afraid of being laughed at.
That social terror, the fear of being laughed at, is completely paralyzing. And the text makes a really profound point here. Learning should feel safe, not stressful. This is what modern psychology calls psychological safety. If a student doesn't feel safe enough to be wrong, they will never, ever take the risk required to eventually be right.
It reminds me of that feeling when you're in a meeting at work and you have an idea, but you don't say it because you're worried your boss might shoot it down. It starts in the classroom.
Oh, absolutely. We are trained so early on that the cost of being wrong is public humiliation. So what do? We maximize for safety. We become the machine, we give the standard answer, we keep our heads down, we survive the day, but we don't grow.
So, okay, we have a system that makes us feel invisible, judges us by a single number, and rules through fear. Sounds pretty bleak. But a source doesn't stop at the complaint. And this is what I really appreciated about it. It pivots to a vision for the future.
Right, the hopeful change.
And the author asks, if we strip away the fear and the obsession with marks, what do we fill that space with? And the answer is life skills.
And notice the kinds of skills the author prioritizes. They aren't asking for more advanced calculus or, coding classes. They're asking for human skills, how to communicate, how to handle failure.
That handling failure one is huge. If we go back to the idea that failure is treated as shame, it makes perfect sense that we never learned how to actually process it constructively.
Exactly. And the third skill they mention is my favorite. How to believe in yourself when no one else does.
That stopped me in my tracks. How to believe in yourself when no one else does.
Yeah.
That is the very definition of resilience, isn't it?
It is. And just think about the current system. You're taught to believe in yourself if the teacher gives you a gold star, if you get the A. Your belief is entirely external. It's conditional. The author is envisioning a system where students are taught to generate that belief internally, to have a core of self-worth that isn't dependent on applause.
Because, as the source so poignantly puts it, because one day exams will end, but life will not.
That is the drop the mic moment of this whole text. It just exposes the short-sightedness of the whole machine. We are optimizing students for a game, the game of school, that ends when they're 18 or 21. But we are sending them out into a reality that operates on completely different rules.
In life, there isn't always a right answer. In life, you fail constantly. In life, no one's going to give you a report card telling you how good of a person you are.
Precisely. And that's why the author makes this crucial distinction. They say, I don't want a perfect school system. I want a human one.
What does a human system look like to you based on this text?
Well, a human system is messy. It allows for bad days. It allows for different pacing. It recognizes that a student might be terrible at math but incredible at empathy. And it actually values both of those things. It's a system where the goal isn't just prepared for exams, but prepared for life.
It feels like the author's trying to make peace with their own past, in a way. They explicitly say, this is not anger, this is hope.
That is such an important tonal note. It would be so easy to just burn it all down, to say, I hate school. But the author is writing this from a place of love. They want the next generation to have what they didn't. They want the cycle of silence and shame to end with them.
It really reframes the whole critique. It's not a complaint, it's a wish. A wish for a world where we actually see the person behind the desk.
And the stakes are so high, the source closes with this grand idea. If we change education, we don't just change the experience of the student, we change the future.
Because those students eventually become the adults who run the world.
Exactly. If you raise a generation in fear and shame, you get a fearful and shameful society. But if you raise a generation in psychological safety, who know how to handle failure and actually believe in themselves, I mean, imagine what that society looks like.
It's a beautiful vision.
Yeah.
But I want to bring it back to the listener, to the person who did that visualization with us at the start. Maybe you're a parent now. Maybe you're a manager. Maybe you're just navigating the world. What do we do with all this?
I think we have to recognize that we're all sort of recovering from the system. We all carry a little bit of that roll number trauma with us. We judge ourselves by our output. We fear making mistakes.
So the first step is maybe just being a little kinder to ourselves.
Yes, but also being the person who asks the questions that weren't asked of us. If you're a manager, don't just ask your employee about the deadline. Ask, are you okay? Are you confused? Create that safety that was missing for you.
And look for the potential, not the percentage.
Right. Look at the quiet person in the room. The one who isn't performing the way the machine demands. There might be a depth of thought there that is just being ignored because it doesn't fit the standard metric.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? The source mentions the student who stays quiet for fear of being laughed at. It just makes you ask, how many brilliant ideas, how many cures, how many works of art have we lost? Not because the talent wasn't there, but because the safety wasn't there.
That is the haunting question, isn't it? Silence isn't always empty. Sometimes silence is just fear holding its breath. And if we can create environments in our schools, in our homes, in our offices, where it's finally safe to exhale, we might be truly surprised by what we hear.
That is a powerful thought to leave us with. This wasn't just a deep dive into school reform. It felt like a deep dive into how we treat each other as human beings.
It really was. It's a reminder that efficiency isn't everything. Humanity matters more.
I want to thank you for going on this journey with us. And it was a little different, a little more introspective than our usual breakdowns. But I think this source really demanded that of us.
It did. It's good to stop the machine sometimes and just listen.
So as you head back into your day, maybe keep that visualization in mind. And maybe, just maybe, try to be the person who breaks the silence for someone else. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next deep dive.